a spouse, a partner in life. But it's much more complicated than that. I think one of the things I can say is that to try to talk about Kierkegaard in an hour is impossible. It is, to use an existential word that he coined and was taken up by the French philosophers of World War II, it's absurd. There's an absurdity in trying to talk about someone as prolific and brilliant as Kierkegaard is in an hour. And the only thing I can do is refer to one of his, a person who was inspired by him, the French existentialist author Albert Camus. Have you heard of Camus? I think some of you have. He was writing at a time when France was occupied by Nazi Germany. Not a very happy time for the French. And Camus wrote a masterpiece called The Myth of Sisyphus. And in Greek mythology, Sisyphus was the poor man who was consigned below the underworld and had to push up this boulder every day, and the boulder would roll back down to the same place it was when he started, and he'd restart the same action day in and day out of pushing this boulder up and having it return to the same point. And for Camus, philosophy had only one question. Do you know what that was? What was the one question of philosophy? Kierkegaard is a big philosopher.
Who am I?
Who am I? No, it wasn't that. Actually, it was related to that.
Yeah.
It was the question regarding suicide. Because if life is absurd and is nonsensical, we've all of us have had feelings of encountering absurdity when you work really hard and it seems like you don't make too much progress and you return to where you were. And Camus said, the choice is either suicide or revolt, and I choose revolt. If you were Sisyphus and this boulder rolled back, that no matter how crazy and absurd life seems, the only way you can make sense of it is to choose freely to revolt and not to enter life. So anyway, the only reason I bring that up is I choose revolt to try to do Kierkegaard in an hour. that's why I'm going into this story. Next slide. We're going to try to ease into his radical thought about Christianity and existentialism by quoting another Dane. Of course, you all know that he was Danish, and he was writing in 19th century Copenhagen, which is a city at that time of only 125,000 people. This was a small little town, and everybody knew everybody else, and he used to go out into the town square and talk to people and engage them, much like Socrates did for the Greeks in Athens. And another very famous Dane named Niels Bohr of the 20th century, who together with Werner Heisenberg, a German physicist, developed the theory of quantum mechanics and the uncertainty principle, said these two quotes, which I think help get us in the mood for Kierkegaard. The first quote is, "How wonderful that we have met with a paradox. Now we have some hope of making progress." The second quote is, "When it comes to atoms, language can be used only as in poetry. The poet, too, is not nearly so concerned with describing facts as with creating images." The two takeaways from this is that the physicist Niels Bohr kind of developed, along with Heisenberg, this idea that when you study atomic structure, you can never, that light waves and particles, you can't tell whether it's matter or energy. It's kind of interchangeable between one and the other. And when you try to determine the position of an atom, the fact that you're observing and studying the atom interferes with what you're looking at and changes it and shifts it. So modern physics, very much like Kierkegaard, comes up with the idea that something can be A and not A simultaneously. Whereas Aristotle all of classic philosophy basically said essence in being is to be found right here at this point, or in this word, or in this concept, not in its opposite, or not in the other concept. But I'm just pointing this out to kind of get you again into the mood that there's sort of a reversal of a lot of classical metaphysics that were handed down to us by the Greeks, particularly Aristotle, that is turned upside down by quantum theory, as well as people like Kierkegaard. Okay? Does that kind of make sense? We're moving into the modern era here. Quick word about the differences between analytic and continental philosophy. This might be a new concept to you, but for mysterious reasons which I don't understand, maybe some of you do, about 250 years ago, there was a split, there was a bifurcation in the study of philosophy. And what happened is that you have the kind of the Anglo-Saxon world, which is the English-speaking world. Our native language is English. We tend to gravitate to the analytical side of philosophy, and it's hard for us. I think someone mentioned difficulty when it comes to Kierkegaard. It's hard for us to make that shift over to this interior psychological side of philosophy. Okay, what is unique?
Do you want me to go back?
I might be. Here we go. Do I have a slide called "What's Unique"? I think I might have this up. Let's go one more. One more than that. Let's see. Okay, let's go back. This was in my notes. I just said, what is unique about Kierkegaard and his works? Why is he a significant writer? And why should you even care about what he has to say today? As a religious and philosophical author, he appeals equally to faith-based believers and to atheists. I don't think that claim can be made for almost any other major writer. Like, who can you think of that has inspired as many professed atheists as faith-based Christian writers and philosophers? It's very, very rare. His literary style is highly developed. He uses irony and what's called indirect communication. We'll talk about that in a while. As well as using pseudonyms as a literary device. So he's not just a theologian and a philosopher, but he's a writer. And language is very important to him, using creative language. His works are still actively read and discussed today. They've stood the test of time. And his exploration and description of the human psyche, what he calls the self, was groundbreaking and revolutionary for his time. He anticipated Sigmund Freud and the discovery of the unconscious mind. He used the metaphor of romantic love and its breakdown and difficulty to illustrate the relation between human and divine love. But as I mentioned, with the breakup with his fiancée, Regine Olsen, human love was unhappy love because it didn't work out for him. When he got his theology degree, of course, what society and the faculty wanted him to do was to get married, have 2 kids, become a parish priest, and move to the Jutland Moors, and basically be the head of a parish. Fit into the church structure and hierarchy, and do what everybody is expected to do at that time. He didn't do it. Fortunately for us, because if he had married and had the kids and become a parish pastor, we would not have the 20-plus major works that he wrote in a period of only 9 or 10 years. He went through an amazing, almost manic phase of a decade where he produced about 10 masterpieces. So his personal unhappiness resulted in our having access to a thinker and writer who actually brought modernity into our lives. His diagnosis and critique of emptiness of modern-day Christendom is anchored by both pre-Christian Greek thought as well as by modern consciousness and German idealism. We'll get into what that is. And he developed the idea of truth as subjectivity in his concluding unscientific postscript. Okay, let's go on to the next slide here. I mentioned before he inspired both atheists and believers. Someone who was very much influenced by him was Karl Barth, who was a Swiss Reformed theologian who wrote Epistle to the Romans in 1919. Is anybody familiar with Barth's Epistle to the Romans? I think you are. Much of Karl Barth's ideas came directly from Kierkegaard. And he didn't really acknowledge him that much, in my opinion. He kind of made him like those were his ideas. On the other side, on the atheist philosopher side, you have someone like Jean-Paul Sartre, who during World War II wrote books like Existentialism is a Humanism. And someone had asked me, what's the definition of existentialism? And I put up there, existence precedes essence. That's going back to this idea that what's important isn't some objective, formulaic truth out there that everybody agrees on. What's important is looking inside and finding what you as an individual find significant and important, and then believing that and following that because that is your truth. And that does involve faith, because this idea of the leap of faith is very much a Kierkegaardian idea, even though he never used the actual words leap of faith. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. Here's a quote from Sickness Unto Death. What a lovely title. The sickness unto death, fear and trembling, the concept of anxiety. These aren't exactly books that people keep on their bedside table, are they? And they sound so dark and so pessimistic that who in their right mind would want to pick them up? Well, you'll find out why you might want to pick it up and study him. So he said here, the greatest hazard of all, losing oneself, can occur very quietly in the world, as if it were nothing at all. No other loss can occur so quietly. Any other loss, an arm, a leg, $5, a wife, etc., is sure to be noticed. Now, in Sickness Unto Death, he writes, this is one of his most famous quotes, a human being is spirit, but what is spirit? Spirit is the self, but what is the self? The self is a relation that relates itself to itself. Or is the relations relating itself to itself in the relation? Now, what's going on in that sentence? There's a lot going on in that sentence. First of all, he's thumbing his nose at the great German philosopher Hegel, because Hegel wrote 30 or 40 years prior to Kierkegaard, and Hegel's opus, which was called Phenomenology of the Mind, which is read by anyone who's serious about Western philosophy. They have to cut their teeth on Hegel. Kierkegaard was very familiar with Hegel and his use of dialectical reasoning, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, which becomes then a new thesis, antithesis, synthesis. But he's making fun of him at the same time that he's using his language in that quote. You follow me? This kind of shows you how what he calls indirect communication and irony is that if you take anything that he writes too seriously, you're probably going to be led to a cliff, and he's going to leave you there. Because ultimately, and this is the one thing, if you remember nothing about today's forum than this idea, ultimately, everything we're talking about today is not about Kierkegaard. It's not about him at all, or any of his pseudonyms. He's trying to lead you into a paradox, an impossibility, an absurd moment where you're forced to go back into your own mind just as Socrates, when he taught in Athens, required of his students. Socrates never claimed to have the answers to questions, and he always put the question back into the lap of the student. So when you reach something that doesn't make sense in Kierkegaard, don't feel frustrated by it. Realize that he's putting it back in your lap. What is your truth? What is your self about? It's not about me. And I created all these pseudonyms to kind of talk about different personalities and different ideas, the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. But all that is almost nonsensical because that's me, that's not you. I'm putting it back in your lap. So going on, continuing this quote from Sickness Unto Death, a human being is a synthesis of the infinite and the finite, of the temporal and the eternal, of freedom and necessity. In short, a synthesis. A synthesis is the relation between the two. Considered this way, a human being is still not a self. A human being is still not a self, even though we're put together as, like we exist in this world where our imagination and our mind can conceive of eternity, and it can also conceive of something that's concrete and fixed, which is non-eternal, which is temporal, which is finite. We're caught between these two extremes. And as I said here, the self for Kierkegaard is really an action verb. It's not a noun. If you don't have a self, you have a self project. Does that make sense? You don't have a self, you have a self project, that we're all in the process of trying to modulate between the temporal and the eternal, the finite and the infinite. And it is precisely the instability of being in between the earth and heaven, God, and this world that creates the tension and the energy which powers the self. And the loss of the self, which leads to despair, consists precisely in turning away from this energy of this, the healthy energy of the self, which is generated by this, what he called the dialectical tension between these opposites, and settling for one versus the other. I don't know if that makes sense. Is that?
Yeah.
It doesn't? Okay. Okay, the next slide. As I mentioned before, he's a major contributor not only to literature, like you can read something like Fear and Trembling, or Either Or, as a great literary masterpiece, and not be interested in the philosophy of the theology, just in terms of the language that he uses. Philology, or philosophy, theology, psychology, sociology, art, aesthetics. Concerning art, I think sometime next month, St. Paul's is going to host the opera Don Giovanni by Mozart. Is that right?
Right.
Who's putting it on? Point Loma. It's over there. Anyway, one thing you can do if you want to prepare for Don Giovanni is read Kierkegaard's essay on it's called The Erotic Stages of Music. It's in Either Or. Of course, the theme of Don Juan as a major seducer plays into Christian morality and to the sensual versus the spiritual. And he talks about the opera Don Giovanni as being a masterpiece, and he goes into the difference between language and music, and how language is reflexive and involves concepts which have this instability because their opposite is always positive, and you're moving back and forth, dialectically in language, whereas in music is sort of non-conceptual, and as the vibrations of the composer reach your ears, there's an auditory, sensual enjoyment which falls out of language. Anyway, I don't have time to go into it, but that one essay about the erotic stages of music is worth reading before you see Don Giovanni. So he was an art critic too, and he folded his theology and his philosophy into the aesthetics of art. Wittgenstein, Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was, I guess, on the, I don't know too much about him, but he was on the Anglo-Saxon side of the analytic register that we talked about a few minutes ago. And he basically said that Kierkegaard was by far the most profound thinker of the last century. Kierkegaard was a saint. He's the only one that said Kierkegaard was a saint. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Here's a little bit of the context and history of his life and times. Remember that it was in the 18th century that you have the period of what's called the Enlightenment. The French philosophers Voltaire, Montesquieu, Diderot, Rousseau were basically making the point that the monarchy in Europe, which was aligned with the church, needed to be overthrown because it involved absolutism and was corrupt. And you had the French Revolution, and you know, it was a very turbulent time of the European Enlightenment. But one of the main ideas that came out of the Enlightenment was that reason, human reason, could somehow lead us to a brighter, happier future. Through reason alone, as reason was almost deified into something that was going to get us there. German Romanticism, you know, that was going on at the same time. And then the philosophy of German idealism. Have most of you heard of Hegel and Kant? Hegel and Kant are two giants of German idealism. When you hear talk of idealistic philosophy or idealism, the word idealism has nothing to do with optimism. That's a common misperception. Idealism has to do with ideas, has to do with a conceptual, with things that are in our head as opposed to things that are out there in the world. So Kant and Hegel were known as the German idealist philosophers, and again, we don't have time to go into them now, but you need to know that Kierkegaard was using their language and at the same time going beyond them, turning them upside down, because particularly for Hegel, Hegel's masterpiece, which was called The Phenomenology of the Spirit, was basically this idea that philosophy and reason through the system, if you just studied hard enough and you incorporated science and culture and religion, that at some point in the future, man would have the mind of God and we would understand everything. So for Hegel, he believed that even though we might not have that knowledge and understanding now, it was just a matter of time before this spiral of absolute knowledge reached a pinnacle and we did have the mind of God. For Hegel, Christianity was but a passing phase. It was an interesting manifestation of the spiritual, but it was nothing particularly special for Hegel. Kierkegaard obviously disagreed with Hegel on that because he was a very devout Lutheran individual who was formed in the Danish Lutheran Church. So we also, getting to the Danish Lutheran Church and his attack on Christendom and the defense of Christianity, it's probably hard for some people to understand that one can defend Christianity while being highly critical of the church at the same time. Most people who talk about ecclesiology or the church, study of the church, defend Christianity in the same breath, right? The two kind of go together. With Kierkegaard, there was a radical split. One of the reasons, to be, in all fairness to him, was that the Danish Lutheran Church, at his time, believe it or not, it hasn't changed that much today. I talked to Padre Björn Jörn Markusen, who helped out with the Hispanic ministry here, and who gives the Wednesday noon Eucharist, and he was telling me that Danish Lutheran Church is the same today as it was in Kierkegaard's time. What that means is that pastors are civil servants of the Lutheran Church in Denmark, as in Norway. They're government employees, so church and state are fused. And if a pastor in a Danish Lutheran church does not say a prayer for the success of the government, he can be summarily fired. So, talk about separation of church and state. Whether we have it in our country or not is another big debate. We're supposed to have it. According to the French, we don't have separation of church and state. But in places like Scandinavia, you really don't have separation of church and state. So that was kind of a historical reason why Kierkegaard was so critical of the church in Denmark, because it was almost indistinguishable from the government. And the radical message of love and redemption that Christ preached seemed to have been lost in a social message. Family life, I kind of talked about the fact that, what family life? You know, he lost 4 or 5 of his siblings. Kierkegaard, when he was at the faculty at the University of Denmark, if you go on the state webpage, denmark.com or whatever it is, they have all these famous Danes and their life stories, and on the Danish website, they make no bones about the fact that Kierkegaard, when he was studying theology, led a somewhat dissolute life. He sowed his wild oats, no doubt about it. And then 2 or 3 years before he graduated, he had some sort of a conversion, some kind of spiritual, religious experience. And he broke off his engagement with Regine Olsen, supposedly under the context that he was giving himself to God, and that if he became practical, and he married and had the 2 kids and moved to the moors, you know, to run a small town parish, he would just sort of do what everybody else was doing, and he felt called by God to take an alternate path, which he did. And fortunately for us, and I think for Christianity, we have him. His doctoral thesis was on the concept of irony with continual reference to Socrates. He loved both Socrates and Plato, the Greek philosophers, and he also loved Christ and his message. And if you really try to study and read Kierkegaard, you almost have to have an encyclopedia of Greek mythology and philosophy here. Then you have to have the Bible and the New Testament here, preferably in Greek. Then you have to have Hegel and Kant here. You have to know about the dialectical imperative and the critique of pure reason. And then you have Kierkegaard. And what we're going to do in a few minutes is we're going to actually show how it's gone beyond Kierkegaard to several postmodern philosophers, one in particular, Jacques Derrida, who's the father of deconstruction, who reads Kierkegaard and who reads Fear and Trembling in the story of Abraham and Isaac, and reinterprets it for the 21st century, making it even more relevant and more interesting than what Kierkegaard said in Fear and Trembling. We're going to get to that, and that has to do with ethics and Christian morality. With me so far? Is there anything that's kind of obtuse or crazy? Okay, let's go on to Hegel here. Does this guy look happy? We're going to inject a little humor here. Here is Hegel, writer of Science of Logic and Phenomenology of the Mind. And as I said, his thought project was the ultimate goal in philosophy, to become, at some point in the future, the mind of God. To know everything, understand everything, in which there would no longer be any mystery or confusion about anything. We just aren't there yet, but we can get there. With enough effort in philosophy, we can get there. And Hegel was the one whose thought and writings proceeded according to what's called dialectical structure. Dialectic means going from one concept to its opposite. You've got good, evil, you've got substance, appearance. And the way he thought was that you can't arrive at truth except if you start with a thesis, some concept, you go to its opposite, you try to reconcile the two in a synthesis, which becomes then a new thesis, finding an antithesis and a synthesis. So it's a triadic structure. A, opposite of A, B being the synthesis, which becomes a new thesis. It's triadic, three-step logical reasoning. And Hegel's dialectic, by the way, became the basis of Karl Marx's manifesto and morphed into what's called dialectical materialism, and indeed all the revolutions that occurred in places like Russia and China and Cuba, where you have the socialists taking over, all were inspired by Hegel's dialectical thought. Even though he wasn't so much a political philosopher, his thought pattern, the triadic structure of this dialectical movement of thought was reinterpreted by Karl Marx as a struggle of classes. So you have different social groups, the underprivileged, the proletariat, who have been dispossessed, fighting with those who own the means of capital, who own capital. And you have this conflict going on, which goes right back to Hegel. So the only reason I bring this up is that Hegel's like really, really, really important. He's just as important as Kierkegaard in terms of what happened in the 20th century politically. A word that's really important in German. Any of you know any German? Okay. Aufheben and Aufhebung. I bet you know what that means. Literally in German it means to lift up. So if I lift my watch up, if it's on the floor and I lift it up, I've done an Aufheben, Aufhebung. But it also figuratively means in German that it goes back to this dialectical movement of thought. It has to do with the idea that when I pick something up physically, it's no longer in the same position it was a minute ago when it was lying on the floor or on the table. It's in a different position, even though it's the same watch. So it's the idea that in dialectical reasoning and in transformation of society and culture, you can start with point A and move to point B without obliterating point A. You, in a sense, preserve that which was in A when you move to B, which is non-A, but it's not like it's pure B. And that's what Aufheben is, Aufhebung. And so, again, this is the history of philosophy, but it's a really important verb in German, Aufheben, which Kierkegaard was very familiar with and which he used in a lot of his discourses and reasoning. Okay, next one. There's a sound. Can you click on that little sound button there on the slide? I don't know if it's activated there. Yeah. It's no big deal, but
There we go.
Sounds of silence. That's what it is. So in the beginning, according to Hegel, in chapter 4 of this phenomenology of the spirit, there was unhappy consciousness. Why, in the beginning of a philosophical inquiry, in the beginning of what's going on at the very inception of the mind, the primal scene, why would there be unhappy consciousness? Well, it goes back to this idea that you have consciousness and self-consciousness, which Kierkegaard was more interested in. Like, who am I? What am I thinking and feeling as a single individual? But for Hegel, there's sort of this infinite progression of moments of self-consciousness where you're constantly discovering something new about yourself or about the world even, but you're realizing a second later that perception that you had was wrong. It was incorrect. It was incomplete. And so this dissociation between your thoughts and feelings of who you thought you were or who you thought the world was about creates unhappy consciousness. And you may not agree with that, but Hegel spent hundreds and hundreds of pages talking about how self-consciousness is born, and he talked about the master-slave dialectic, which again was picked up by the Marxists. Kierkegaard doesn't take it in that direction. He takes it in a Christian direction, a spiritual direction. But unhappy consciousness, if you ever have the time to pick up Hegel and read him, you'll get it. And it's hard for our society sitting here to understand why in the beginning there was unhappy consciousness. If you haven't read Hegel, but believe me, if you read him, you'll get it. Okay, so let's go on to the next slide. So for Kierkegaard, as for Hegel, unhappy consciousness was understood as a key component of self-consciousness and the self's relation to itself and to the other. The unhappiness of self-consciousness stemmed from the dual split and contradictory nature of consciousness itself. The fact that we are not one with the world. We are separate. And that distance between us and the world kind of gives us that feeling, I'm not a fusion with the world. I'm not able to forget myself and be one with the world. So there's a certain anxiety that results from that. And of course, we've only got 10 minutes to go, and we haven't even finished our introduction, so I'm going to start to accelerate and try to get through this. Remember, I choose revolt over suicide, like Remy said, right? I'm trying to do the absurd, but I choose to act. I choose my own responsibility. Down here at the bottom, these negative emotions, which make up the titles of most of his works: anxiety, despair, sickness unto death, fear and trembling, the role of offense in Christianity, the idea that Christianity is an offense to reason, it's an offense to society in terms of Christ's radical questioning of where your ultimate faith lies. But let me just read you something from Kierkegaard's concept of anxiety to kind of give you an idea about what he thought about anxiety. He says, "And no grand inquisitor has such frightful torments in readiness as has anxiety, and no secret agent knows as cunningly how to attack the suspect in his weakest moment, or to make so seductive the trap in which he will be snared. And no discerning judge understands how to examine, yes, exanimate, to take the soul out of someone, the accused, as does anxiety, which never lets him go, not in diversion, not in noise or music, not at work, not by day, not by night." So what's the antidote to this? And again, anxiety has to do with this fact that man doesn't quite know, man or woman, human being doesn't quite know where they fit on this continuum between eternity and temporality, the infinite and the finite, that we're somewhat disoriented and lost amongst these opposites, these dialectical opposites. And that sense of disorientation is exactly what leads to anxiety. And anxiety, by the way, for Kierkegaard, is not a state of pathology that we need to get rid of or run away from or take pills for or repress. Anxiety and dread are precisely the things that we need to turn and face, because that is the path towards faith. You cannot get to faith automatically. You don't get to faith without passing through this fear and trembling that we're going to talk about in Genesis 22. Make sense? That kind of makes sense? In other words, he's not, there are biographical reasons why Kierkegaard talks a lot about these negative emotions, but ultimately there's a philosophical reason which goes back to Hegel and the unhappy consciousness, as well as the fact that it provides a stumbling block for faith. Okay, let's jump ahead now to, we talked about, you all know, here's the essay in Either Or, the immediate erotic stages of the musical erotic. It's the analysis of Mozart's opera Don Giovanni from an aesthetic perspective that manages to convince readers that music, unlike language, is basically erotic and demonic in nature due to its immediacy and auditory sensuality. And here he's being a little ironic himself. He's kind of playing with us because the whole theme of Don Giovanni is this seducer who seduces thousands of women and is held up as this evil, demonic person who needs to perish and go to hell and be burned up in the end of the opera, right? So he's not too far off in talking about the erotic and the demonic here. Okay, let's go on. Now let's go finally to Fear and Trembling. Let's get to Fear and Trembling, because that's the ultimate here. We've got like 5 minutes to do
Well, and
this.
George, one of the things I want to say is you're doing such a wonderful job working through this that we have an open forum in August, like late August, if you want to take the second half and do it then, or if you want to continue and push through. But I think you're moving at such a wonderful pace. I would be up for that, but I don't know if you are.
We'll see. We'll
Okay.
determine that later. It cannot be determined at this time.
Right. Well, I just don't want you to feel rushed.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So let's go to Fear and Trembling. There's a picture of Abraham and Isaac. Here we go. Genesis 22. So let's read it again, but for the first time with Kierkegaard, or his pseudonym, Johannes de Silencio. And later, with Jacques Derrida in The Gift of Death. You might wonder, why would anyone write a book called The Gift of Death? Jacques Derrida was the postmodern French philosopher who kind of has rediscovered Kierkegaard and took up the story of Abraham and Isaac as the foundational text on faith in the monotheistic religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. So if we go back to Genesis 22, I think all of you know the story, don't you? It's a terrible story. It's a story that has everything to do with fear and trembling. And for those of us who think of Christianity and religion in general as a self-help modality where basically it's supposed to help us feel better, right? You walk in any bookstore and there's thousands of self-help books. And many of us, naturally so, it's understandable, look at Christianity as helping us feel good, right? Isn't that what religion's all about? And here we have Kierkegaard going in 180 degrees in the opposite direction with fear and trembling. How can this be? How can it be that if you go through the fear and trembling of Abraham, who was told basically to kill or murder his son Isaac, and which was a command from God, how can this story of fear and trembling have anything to do with faith? And that's what fear and trembling is all about. It's also, Kierkegaard takes off, he uses a reference to a line from Philippians. Let's go to the next slide. I think maybe the second or the third. Let's move on. Move back. Let's move back. I'm sorry. Let's stop here for a minute. There is a quote from Philippians 2:12 from St. Paul, where St. Paul talks about, in his absence, the disciples need to continue working out their salvation with fear and trembling, because St. Paul is no longer there physically to help them, to assist them, to encourage them. He's gone. He's absent. So in his absence, you have this moment of fear and trembling that is talked about in the New Testament. But the basic idea for Kierkegaard in fear and trembling is that Abraham had to go outside the world of ethics in order to respond to God's command to sacrifice his son. Right? ethics, as generally understood, is what all of us agree on in terms of the commonality, of the general. When you talk to people, when you try to justify your actions and your decisions, you're appealing to the fact that most people you're talking to or communicating with agree with you, that what you did was the right thing. And that agreement comes from the social domain of culture and society. But Kierkegaard and Derrida are also saying it's precisely the fact that, it's hard to even say this, the phrase that's used to kind of describe it in philosophy courses is the teleological suspension of the ethical. What does that mean? What is the telos is the end game. That's what you're striving for at the end of your action. And what's suspended is the ethical. What's suspended in the story of Abraham and Isaac is ethics itself. Because how could God ask the father of faith to murder his beloved son? How indeed? So that violates everything that we would think of and feel is right in terms of ethics. So it's suspended. And the pseudonym who's writing about Abraham is Johannes de Silencio. The word silencio means, of course, silent, non-verbal. Because what happened, and this is very important for Derrida, what happened in this story is that, let's skip forward to Derrida here. One more. There he is. There's the famous French philosopher. He died of pancreatic cancer in 2004, known as the father of deconstruction. But for Derrida, what's very important is that Abraham, during this time of listening to God and lifting the knife, of course he didn't kill his son. God intervened and provided a ram instead. But during that terrifying moment when Abraham was ready to murder his son, he could not speak about it. He could not tell anybody. He could not tell Sarah. He could not tell Eliezer, his son. He had to go into a moment of profound isolation and silence. So during that terrifying moment, there was no presence within language. There was no way you could ever talk about the terror of that moment. And Derrida kind of makes the point that any decision that is momentous, any decision that is made by an individual where you actually have to make the decision yourself and you're not making it because of pressure from the group or because you think it's right and people will agree with you, that terror, that trembling is something that has been lost in Christianity. Because Christianity is all about the via media, right? In the Episcopal Church, the middle way, and let's just bring all these things together and have a happy medium. Let's all just be happy and get along together. And it's a communal type thing, which avoids this terrifying moment that Abraham has when God tells him to murder his son. So Derrida goes into, he actually makes the statement that there's always a big temptation. He says, the ethical way is always an easy temptation and way out of responsibility. Why would he say that ethics is a drop out of responsibility? Well, because if you go back to the Abraham story, Abraham was responding to God's call. He was doing everything in his power to be responsible, to prove to God that he had faith in him, that he would follow him, he would believe in him. Even if it meant violating and creating a monstrous act of killing his own son. And Derrida goes on also to say, since we've only got a minute left, actually minus a minute, that every decision we make in silence, we make in isolation, because to the fact, and if you think about this, it's true. When you're faced with ethical decisions, we've always got society and culture in mind. I want to make a decision that everybody agrees with, right? Because I don't want to be isolated. I don't want people to think that I'm crazy, or that I'm like Abraham who would murder his own son. None of us want people to look at us that way. And yet, in this primal scene of faith, and again, this is all about faith, there's this moment of madness, you could call it. It is a moment of madness where, you know, Abraham is doing something that is outside of ethics. So, we're at the end of our hour, and it's like some of these ideas about ethics need to be unpacked a lot more than what I tried to do in this hour. But I hope that I've given you some idea about why Kierkegaard feels that fear and trembling and anxiety and despair are emotions that you shouldn't run away from, and that they are, in a way, the pathway to faith with God, because it goes back to Genesis 22, which is the primal scene of faith for Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. So this is considered to be just an introduction, and I thank you for your time, and we've got, thank you, Sarah.